It started on a late Sunday afternoon when the cicadas were buzzing and the heat lingered in the cul-de-sac like a heavy blanket. I had just returned from the dealership the day before with the car I had dreamed about for years. A brand new metallic gray SUV, polished so well it mirrored the summer sky. The smell of leather still clung to the cabin, and every time I slipped behind the wheel, I felt the kind of pride that comes only after years of saving and sacrifice. I parked it in my own garage, locked the door, and went inside for the night without a second thought. But the next day, the nightmare began. As I pressed the button to raise my garage door, the sound of the mechanical hum drew the attention of the woman across the street, the self-appointed enforcer of our HOA Karen. She had lived there for years, ruling with petty fines and absurd complaints, puffing herself up with authority she didn't actually have. The moment she saw the SUV gleaming inside my garage, her eyes widened with shock and then narrowed with fury. She waddled closer, her phone already in hand, shouting that I had stolen her car. At first, I laughed, thinking she was joking in that cruel way she often did when belittling neighbors. But the venom in her voice, the way her fat face twisted into indignation, left no doubt she believed her own lie. She screamed at me to step away from the vehicle, as though I were a thief caught red-handed, even though it sat inside my garage. Before I could speak, she stabbed at her phone and dialed 911 right there in the driveway, declaring loud enough for the neighborhood to hear that I had stolen her brand new SUV. My chest tightened. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding, it was a public accusation. One that could ruin me if the cops arrived, believing her word over mine. I tried to reason with her, holding up the key fob that the dealership had handed me less than 24 hours ago. "This is my car, Karen," I said firmly, but she only cackled, claiming I must have stolen the keys too. Her voice dripped with malice. Her finger pointed at me like a dagger. By then, neighbors started gathering. Curtains twitched, front doors opened, and people peeked out as if waiting for blood to spill. The woman next door, Mrs. Flores, whispered to her husband that Karen's brand new car had actually been delivered to her last week, but it was bright blue, not metallic gray. That truth didn't matter to Karen. She was so drunk on her own sense of power that reality had become irrelevant. She strutted forward, planting herself at the edge of my driveway, shouting into the phone about a violent suspect in possession of stolen property. My hands shook with rage and disbelief. How could she do this? How could someone be so entitled as to weaponize the police against an innocent man in his own garage? When the wail of sirens grew closer, my stomach dropped. I knew too well how quickly such a scene could spiral out of control. I thought of all the stories where men had been cuffed, dragged, or worse because of false accusations. I grabbed the thick folder from the kitchen counter where I had left the paperwork. The sales contract, the financing agreement, the official title application, every document proving the SUV was mine. I stood there in the driveway, papers in hand, as the cruiser rolled up, lights flashing. The officer stepped out cautiously, his hand near his holster, eyes scanning between me and Karen. And Carino, she put on a show. She ran toward him, puffing dramatically, wailing that I had stolen her car and threatened her life. Theatrics worthy of a soap opera. The officer's gaze locked on me. "Sir, step away from the vehicle." My heart pounded. For a moment, I wanted to scream, but I forced myself to breathe. I held up the folder, voice shaking but steady enough. "Officer, I have every document here. This car is mine." "She's lying." Karen shrieked louder, insisting I had forged the papers, but I caught something in the officer's eyes: skepticism. He had seen this sort of nonsense before. Still, he asked me to place the documents on the hood for review. I obeyed, my hands trembling as I laid them out like cards in a high-stakes poker game. The officer skimmed through the pages, tracing VIN numbers, cross-checking against the registration. He walked around to the windshield, noting the temporary plate taped inside, matching it against the paperwork. Then he turned to Karen. "Ma'am, what color is your car?" Karen blinked, her bluster faltering for the first time. "Gray," she blurted. But the neighbors gasped, because we all knew she had paraded her own blue SUV around just days earlier, honking the horn to show it off. Mrs. Flores spoke up, her voice cutting through the tension. "That's not true, officer. Her car is blue. We all saw it." A murmur of agreement rippled across the cul-de-sac. Karen's face flushed red, but she doubled down, stomping her foot, insisting everyone else was lying. The officer's jaw tightened. He asked for her keys. With a dramatic flourish, she pulled them from her pocket and pressed the button. Nothing happened. She pressed again, jabbing the button so hard her thumb turned white. The SUV in my garage didn't budge, didn't blink. The crowd laughed nervously, and the officer raised an eyebrow. I seized the moment. I held up my own key fob, pressed the button once, and the SUV chirped with life. Lights flashed, doors unlocked, proof undeniable. Karen let out a shrill scream, the kind that curdled the air, and she lunged at me, trying to snatch the keys from my hand. The officer caught her by the arm, restraining her as she flailed and cursed. It was surreal, this woman, so puffed up with imaginary authority, now writhing like a child denied candy. The officer warned her firmly that making false reports to 911 was a serious crime. He asked me if I wished to press charges. For a heartbeat, I considered it. The humiliation she had tried to heap upon me, the danger she had put me in, it burned like acid in my veins. But I hesitated, unsure if escalating would heal anything. That's when the twist came. Out from the corner of the street, a car rolled slowly toward us. Another SUV, but this one was unmistakably blue, with dealership plates still hanging. Behind the wheel was Karen's husband, a weary man with sagging shoulders and tired eyes. He parked and stepped out quietly, keys in his hand. The silence was deafening as he walked over, raised his fob, and his SUV blinked in confirmation. He looked at the officer, then at me, then finally at Karen, whose mouth gaped open like a fish pulled from water. His voice was calm but laced with shame. She knew the whole time. She just wanted to humiliate him. The crowd erupted in gasps, and Karen's body deflated, her authority collapsing like a balloon with a pinprick. The silence that followed her husband's confession was the kind that makes the world tilt on its axis. Neighbors stood frozen, their hands over their mouths, their eyes darting from him to Karen like spectators at a courtroom trial. The officer's face hardened into something grim, because what had just been exposed wasn't confusion, it was malice. And malice in front of witnesses, documented by law enforcement, carried consequences that Karen had never anticipated. She tried to recover, her voice wobbling as she whined that she only wanted to protect the neighborhood from criminals. But the officer cut her off sharply, reminding her that filing a false police report was a criminal act in itself. Her husband shook his head, his shoulders sagging deeper. "You've done this before," he said softly, almost to himself. "Last year with the Smiths when you accused them of trespassing on their own backyard. 2 years ago with the Hendersons when you called animal control on their therapy dog. And now this." Karen's lips quivered, but her eyes still blazed with defiance. She twisted toward the crowd, pleading for sympathy, but found none. The people she had bullied for years, the ones she had fined for cracked driveways, reported for grass too tall, harassed for having too many guests, were now glaring back at her like a jury that had reached its verdict. No one spoke up to defend her. Not one. I watched her composure crack, layer by layer, as realization dawned that the power she had wielded so mercilessly was evaporating in front of her. The officer gently but firmly informed her that she would be taken to the station for questioning. She exploded at that, thrashing against his grip, shrieking that she was the HOA president and therefore above these petty laws. The words echoed through the cul-de-sac like a confession of her corruption. Neighbors muttered angrily. Mrs. Flores, who had lived under Karen's thumb for decades, suddenly stepped forward, her voice trembling but fierce. "Enough is enough. She doesn't represent us. She never has." Her husband, normally quiet, added, "She's hurt this community more than she's ever helped it." One by one, others began speaking, recounting stories of fines, harassment, and intimidation. A dam had broken, and the flood poured out. Karen tried to shout over them, but her voice was swallowed by the wave of truth crashing down. I stood there, stunned, watching the house of cards she had built topple under its own arrogance. And then came the final twist, the one no one expected. The officer's partner arrived, stepping out of a second cruiser with a body camera already rolling. He asked for a recap, and the lead officer summarized the false report, the documents, the key fob test, the husband's confirmation, and the neighbor's testimonies. The partner nodded gravely, then revealed that the 911 call had been recorded in real time. On it, Karen had not only lied about the car being stolen, but had escalated the situation by claiming I was armed and dangerous. That hit me like a punch to the chest. She had tried to paint me as a threat, knowing full well what could happen if officers approached with weapons drawn. My blood ran cold. The neighbors gasped audibly, some clutching their children closer. The officer's voice dropped low with anger as he told her she had risked not just my life but everyone's by making such a claim. Karen's face crumbled. Her bravado melted into something feral, desperate. She tried to blame me, accuse her husband of betrayal, lash out at Mrs. Flores, but nothing stuck. The truth was too solid, too heavy. When the officer placed her in handcuffs, the sound of the metal clicking shut was like thunder rolling across the street. She screamed and flailed, but her power was gone. She was escorted into the cruiser while the neighbors stood rooted, some in shock, others finally smiling with relief. The queen of petty tyranny was dethroned in the most public way possible, and there was no undoing it. In the days that followed, the fallout spread through the community like wildfire. The HOA board called an emergency meeting, not to defend her, but to strip her of her title. Records of her past complaints and manipulations came to light. Fake violation notices, inflated fines, even misuse of HOA funds. The shame was so great that she and her husband quietly moved out within the month. Their house sold at a loss, their empire of intimidation reduced to whispers of disgust. But the story didn't end with her collapse. Something bigger took root. The neighborhood changed. Freed from her reign, people began to talk, to connect, to rebuild trust. Block parties returned. Children played outside without fear of being reported. The Flores family planted a garden that had once been forbidden. The Henderson's therapy dog became the unofficial mascot of the cul-de-sac. For the first time in years, it felt like a community, not a dictatorship. And for me, the man who had simply wanted to enjoy his new car, the ordeal left scars but also a strange gift. A reminder that truth, though fragile under attack, could survive if enough people stood together to defend it. One evening, weeks after the incident, I sat in the driver's seat of my SUV as the sun set over the street, painting the houses in gold. I thought about how close I had come to losing everything because of one woman's lies. But I also thought about the moment the neighbors had spoken up, their voices rising in unison, refusing to let her lies bury me. That memory filled me with gratitude. I realized then that communities aren't built by rules written in HOA binders or fines pinned to doors. They're built by courage, ordinary people daring to say, "This isn't right." Karen's downfall was bitter, but it carried a lesson for all of us. Entitlement, unchecked, can rot a neighborhood from the inside. But justice, once awakened, can heal it. And as I parked my car in the garage that night, I whispered a silent vow. Never again would I let lies define me. Never again would I stand silent while power was abused. This was my home, my car, my life, and I had defended it with nothing more than truth and resolve. And that had been enough. Now I leave the story with you. Was I right to let the truth speak for itself instead of pressing charges further? Or should I have pursued every legal consequence against Karen to the bitter end? Share your thoughts. What would justice have looked like to you?